Well, to talk a bit more then about Harris's trip, I'm pleased to be joined on the programme by Alex Vines. He's the head of the Africa programme at Chatham House. Welcome to the programme, sir. Thanks for joining us.
Very much.
Why do you think that Harris is starting this trip in Ghana?
Well, Ghana has a history of being very pro-Western, friendly to the United States. It's part of the Nana Akufo-Addo administration's policy also. And she did this morning announce that $100 million for support for stabilization, counter-terrorism efforts in the coastal states, which includes Ghana. That's really important. And Ghana is the lead country in something called the Accra Initiative. So I think that's why Ghana was chosen as the first place to start this trip. It was an important announcement that the US made this morning.
What about Chinese influence, though, in Ghana at the same time? Because I know that the Guyanese finance minister has recently been in Beijing to try and negotiate with the Chinese government to secure a loan, because Ghana is in the midst of a significant financial crisis right now. The US isn't offering anything that could counter that kind of Chinese investment, is it?
Well, the US has neglected the African continent, so you're absolutely right. But as President Nana Akufo-Addo stated, Ghana doesn't want to be pigeonholed. It wants a menu of international partnerships, of which China is part of that. The reality is that Chinese FDI, foreign direct investment, and other investments into the continent have been on the decline since 2019. And so there's a lot more room on the African continent for others to increase their engagement. And that's, I think, what the ambition of the current US administration is. The problem is that the United States private sector is a lot more cautious. I'm speaking to you from New York at the moment. And Africa feels very much more distant currently from New York than from Europe or even at times from Beijing. And so I think the Biden administration's got a lot of work to do to get the US corporate world to more engage in the African continent.
And her next stop will be Tanzania, Kamala Harris. What's your sense as to why she's crossing the continent and heading there?
Well, again, another good question, and I think you can skim a stone, so to speak, for the three countries. Ghana has historically had good relations in the recent past with the United States and the West. You have a reforming president that is in Tanzania, and so Tanzania looks as if it's becoming more truly non-aligned. It had been tilting towards China for a while. And then the final country on the trip is Zambia at the end of this week. And again, that had a democratic advance for an election, and the current president there, HH, he'll need to deal with China, but he is also looking to be encouraging a lot more Western investment. So I think that's the choice of these three countries. They are all democracies, and they are all showing progress in that direction.
When we talk about US influence on the continent, Chinese influence on the continent, people often sort of bring up Russia as part of that. I mean, what do you make of that, this idea that there's this sort of almost a neo-colonial renewed kind of scramble for Africa and in terms of resources on the continent? Do you think that that's how this is playing out, or is that far too simplistic a way to understand what the US is doing in those other countries as well?
So I do think that African countries have a lot more agency than, a 19th century scramble for Africa. But I do think it feels Cold War-ish, yes. And certainly from Washington, there's a sense of if you're not for us, you're against us, although Biden's tried to moderate that discourse recently. You saw how he tried to reframe that at the US-Africa Leaders Summit that happened in Washington last December. But the reality is that there is real paranoia in Washington, here in the United States, about China, a lot more so than about Russia. And I think that's really underpinning one of the reasons for this frenetic activity of visits by the US administration under the Biden presidency to try and ensure that African nations, presidents, elites know that they have choice, and that choice includes the United States.
It's interesting that you say that the US is probably more concerned about Chinese influence than Russian influence on the continent. I would have perhaps assumed the other. I imagine France rather concerned about the Russian influence, particularly in West Africa and the Sahel. Why is the US more concerned about China, do you think?
I think this is about the United States having to recognize that there are two superpowers in the world. That's not Russia, and that China is a strategic competitor. In a way, the reading about Russia is that Russia is managing decline. It's in a sense a former imperial state, just like France or the United Kingdom, that is managing decline. China is rising. And I think that's why strategic planners in the long term in Washington and in the US are much more concerned about China. In the short term, you're absolutely right. Russia can be very irritating and destabilizing. We've seen that in the Central African Republic. We've seen that in Mali. And France in particular has been in the crosshairs of that.
Alex Vines from Chatham House, thank you very much indeed, sir, for your time on the programme today.
Thank you.